It's such a pleasure to get to speak to Holly Ransom, who's the CEO of Emergent. She's a consultant. She is so much more than that. She was picked as one of the 100 most influential women by the Australian Financial Review. Sir Richard Branson chose her as one of the game changers to watch. She is a Fulbright Scholar, and she also delivered a peace charter to the Dalai Lama. And Holly, I'd like to start there if I could, because is peace something you'd love to see a lot more of in these turbulent times?
Oh, without question. Firstly, thank you for making the time to have a chat. It's wonderful to be here with you. And I've been thinking about it all weekend. You know, the images that we are watching, flooding our news feeds, our screens, you name it at the moment, the unrest, the distress, the anger, the emotion, it's a really unsettling time. And I think on top of what really has been the most tumultuous start to a year I think I can ever remember, I think many can ever remember with COVID, when you see now the state of play, and I think just a level of probably visibility to a range of inequities within our society that I think, you know, some would argue we've always had, others would argue we've perhaps never been made more aware of than we have through what COVID has done. And now obviously the situation with Black Lives Matter probably becoming more public in terms of the demonstrations than we've seen in recent years. It's a really challenging time. And I think it's one of those ones that you find yourself thinking about at a system level. It's one of the ones you find yourself questioning at an individual level, saying, what more can I do? What more can we all do? And where does this end? How do we move forward in a more constructive manner together? What does extending that olive branch look like? And what is doing something meaningful to make reparation and to reset the very foundations of what is generations of pain and suffering? How do we do that?
Yeah, and you know, that's interesting because that speaks to a lot of what you've worked on for a very long time. You know, we talk about disruption, and it's such a buzzword, but what we're seeing is disruption. And I think many people are highly alarmed by just how widespread, how thoroughly comprehensive and deeply troubling this disruption really is. Do you think leaders are going to have to rethink what we mean when we say disruption?
It's a really good point, because I think that language has been taken by Silicon Valley in the last decade, perhaps, and we've used it to really mean things specific to technology, and often generally with a more positive undertow than negative. You know, we might have seen a behemoth of a business that had been asleep at the wheel that's been disrupted, but generally a whole, we consumers felt like we benefited. Most people would argue that the wave of disruption was a net win. I think when you certainly look at the disruption, or the context we're using that word in this year, it's got a more overtly challenging or negative tone to it. I think the challenge for each of us is to find what are the positives, because I do think it is true that we can never waste a crisis. And I think for a lot of people, they're hoping that there are aspects of things that we've discovered or uncovered that we won't return to when we reset as part of this new normal. Be that, you know, social issues we're now more acutely aware of that we're going to make a more concerted effort either to fund, or we're going to take a very fundamentally different approach to. I know a lot of people I've been speaking to are saying, hey, I hope flexible work will actually take on a much more tangible meaning in most workplaces now that we've proven we can do it to a far greater degree than perhaps we'd ever tried it. So I think we have to work to find the good. We have to make sure that some of the pain and disruption and challenge doesn't go unheard or unattended to. And that I think you're right, we need to take a more holistic approach, and understand as well that probably whenever we use that word, it's never equally applied. I mean, there's always in disruption winners and losers, and we need to be mindful of both sides of that coin every time.
Well, and you spoke earlier about the pandemic, and I want to speak about that for just a minute, because in the United States, and you have deep ties to the United States through your business work and through your academic pursuits as well. And in the United States, we know that African Americans have been more affected by the COVID pandemic, both in terms of deaths, health outcomes, and also in terms of job losses. We know that women have been more affected by the pandemic, and that's across the board, not simply in the United States. And I know that's something that you focus on as well. So while we look at the positives, which are, hey, you can work from home if you want to, the reality is that working from home is complex. And for people who have kids, more women are finding that they're having those responsibilities and not getting the opportunity to work. That's a long question, Holly, but I guess it's more of a conversation. Tell me where you want to take that, if you will.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned women in particular, because I just finished reading sort of Invisible Work before the pandemic hit, which talks about sort of the invisibility of a lot of the gendered challenges that women face, particularly obviously one of those being the percentage of unpaid care work that women do. And again, we know all the statistics I've read, at least during the pandemic, have said that the additional burden of be it homeschooling children or additional care responsibilities have overwhelmingly fallen to women again. I think probably one of the things that's an interesting side effect, and again, I think we'll only see how this plays out in the passing of time, is there probably has been more visibility of the burden and the expectation and the breadth of the responsibility that role entails, by virtue of the fact people have been home at least witnessing it, if nothing else. So I hope that there will be more recognition of that. I hope that might lead to a public dialogue around how we do a better job of valuing that. But you're absolutely right. We've seen, I think, probably in a more acute way, the inequities that have been bubbling beneath our society for so long really pop up and rear their ugly heads. And it's on all of us to go, let this be the moment where we started to change things, where we can look back and tell, kids and grandkids down the line that this is where we decided we were really going to do something different about that, because it wasn't good enough. And we can't argue now we didn't know and we haven't seen it.
Yeah, I think you're right. We can't argue that at all. And you have the ear of CEOs. So what are you saying to those leaders in terms of how they can make sure that people of color, that women are fairly treated as we make our way through this pandemic and through this time of great disruption?
Look, it's a great question. I think my message to them in the conversations we're having is the question I'm asking really of them is, how are you building back better? So there's no point building back the way that you had before. What are you doing that is different? How are you thinking about your employees, your community footprint, your customers, your very delivery model differently? And how do you put at the center of that empathy and your corporate social responsibility? I think we've seen great examples with Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel and a number of the female leaders actually throughout the globe of leading with empathy during this period. I think that has probably never been a more important skill in leadership than it is now, particularly when we think about the level of distrust and challenge that's just so present across so many aspects of our community and our society right now. So I think that's a really important one. How do you lead with empathy? The other one, I think this will fundamentally reset what we mean by good corporate citizen. I'm in a lot of conversations week to week where people are reflecting, because this pandemic is such a universal challenge, be that to countries, be that to companies. It's not hitting every country and company the same way, but everyone is challenged by it. To a degree, we have this sense of comparison that I don't feel like we've ever had or felt like we've had before, where we're evaluating leaders one against the other, going, who did a better job of managing the public health outcome or making sure the economy didn't take a hit. We're doing the same with companies. Who did a better job of taking care of their people through this time? Who did a better job of investing in the community that's provided for that business for such a long period of time? And I think we'll see people reward that out the other side. I know a lot of conversations I'm having with top talent, they're talking about that as a lens of evaluating businesses. I'm seeing a lot of people talk about more intentionally buying local and supporting local business again. So I think leaders need to be really mindful of how they are navigating this period. It's challenging for everyone, but there's a way of navigating this with compassion and empathy and doing right by people, or there's a way of really allowing that to sit in your blind spot. And as we've seen some companies do, take advantage of different government mechanisms available, or really focus on making business decisions that have very much a prioritization. And I'm not suggesting this in and of its entirety is wrong, but prioritizing shareholder interests and bottom line in the immediacy, as opposed to thinking about more medium, long term and how you actually protect and grow those two things.
Do you want to get specific there? Because I'd love to hear your analysis of which companies you think are doing a good job. And you mentioned Angela Merkel, you mentioned Jacinda Ardern. Are there any other world leaders who you think are doing a particularly good job of navigating these turbulent times?
Yeah, do you know, I've been really impressed by a number of actually city mayors across the world. I think it's been really interesting to watch, and it's probably a level of leadership that for some time we've argued was going to take on, I think, a greater role in the period ahead. We've talked about global cities, we've talked about kind of this movement where we're saying, particularly world cities, we're going to play a greater role in kind of the state of play moving forward. I've been impressed by the governor of New York. I've been impressed by, I think here in where I live right now in Melbourne, Sally Capp's done a great job. I think across the board, actually, the state leaders in Australia have really risen to a prominence that we probably haven't seen premiers within the national conversation, within national issues management for some time. So I've actually think it's probably been that's been really interesting. One thing I'll credit the Australian government, I think, for having done a really good job on that I don't think I've seen in my lifetime, is actually having an open door policy where they've been in conversation with business and unions and stakeholders, probably with a greater diversity and with a greater preparedness to listen and act rapidly than I feel like we've seen. And that's been wonderful. You hope that we could cling to some of that when we return to more stable times, because I think that's a trait that leads to better government, leads to better relationship between people and their government too, when they feel like they're open and responsive. So they'd be a couple of the things I've observed that I think have been really impressive.
I wonder, one more question before we get to the Fulbright. I wonder, so often I think people, as you go through a difficult time and you go back, for example, to the global financial crisis, which was not that long ago.
No.
And people could be forgiven for saying, hey, we said there was going to be change then, but actually it seems like it's gotten much worse, and that the inequities in the system really only seem to intensify. So how do leaders, what do they need to do to make sure that as we go forward, we fix those things that were still broken or that have broken as a result of dealing with a global pandemic?
Yeah, that's the big question I hope every leader is asking themselves, because it's very circumstantial, obviously, to their footprint and their role. But I think the thing that is critical to your point is that everyone is asking themselves that question, and there's an accountability in having an answer to it. Whatever your answer looks like, whatever way you framed what your company, what you as an individual, what your family, what your community can do, I think it's important that each of us have reached a conclusion on that. And I think that can be as simple as, how do you do a more intentional job of being mindful of your employees' mental health? Because we know people have been stretched and challenged in unprecedented ways during this period, and that won't go away in a month or 2 months. This is going to be challenging for some period of time, and we need to be thinking about what support looks like. How do we create systems and processes and have assistance within our support services that can meet people where they are and can help them along their journey? That's one aspect of it. Then there's obviously the piece around, what within your business's footprint makes most logical sense for you to lean into and make a really significant contribution to. Is it an aspect of the environment? Is it an aspect of, more community challenges in a people sense? What way do you want to define, based on your business's role, supply chain, etc., what it is you're going to do to help build back better? So I think it's very much individual. I think what I hope everyone will hold people's feet to the fire on is that they're asking that question and that there's some kind of meaningful response. And I think the other thing is making sure that we don't lose sight of the fact that the repair on this will be much, much more prolonged than the acuteness of the, the original spike sounds like the wrong word, but the original spike in
almost assault, Holly, right? Almost the assault on life as we knew it from before.
Completely. I was reading a report this morning that's saying, they don't think the New York Stock Exchange will recover for 6 years. So when you're looking at that, we've got to remember that people are on that journey for 2 years, for 4 years, for 6 years, well after this moves out of our media cycle, or the dominance of our media cycle that it has right now, where 3/4 of our news at nights or in the mornings is on this topic. We've got to remember that people are still going to be out of work or underemployed, and we've got to find a way of trying to maintain visibility of that when it's naturally not in our frame of mind as regularly, and continuing to commit to the effort necessary to build back.